So we're going to continue with the next presentation by Sampath, who has been here several times. And well, I'm not going to waste too much time, Ryan. We just get dive into the thick of things.
Great. Thank you, Alfred, and thank you again for organizing the conferences. It's always a great pleasure to be able to meet people and listen to different presentations. I'll dive right in, as Alfred said. Let me see if I can share my slides.
Should be possible.
Uh, let's see here. Does it appear for you, Alfred?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
see it clearly.
So, as Alfred mentioned, I'll just dive right in, and it'll feel like I'm in the middle of a presentation as opposed to having a beginning. So I apologize for that, but I'm going to take us straight into being in time first before I get to Hölderlin's The Hymn, the Ister, the 1942 lecture. And this is the title of the talk, which has changed. And it's incomplete, foregrounding the possibility of appropriating Heidegger's Hölderlin's Hymn, the Ister, but for what? And for me, it's always a return back to being in time, Sein und Zeit, and in particular, the missing division 3. So what we have here are two sections that I'd like to read from quickly, which is section 74, chapter 5, division 2 on temporality and historicality, Geschichtlichkeit. And for me, the kind of critical moments, culminating moments really, in this section 74 on the Augenblick, the moment of vision. So I'm going to stop sharing and bring up the actual text by Heidegger and being in time, and we can look at that. Always in between slides here. Okay, back to being in time. So we can see. Can you see this, Alfred? No.
Yes, I can see it.
The text. Great.
Looks like
Okay.
being in time to me.
Good. Yep, it is. So I'm just going to read the opening paragraph, a sentence of this second paragraph, and then quickly move to Macquarie and Robinson's translation of a few key terms, because I think it sets up this question of the Geschick that we're going to find in the Hölderlin lecture on the destinings of the Greeks and, of course, the Germans in that critical moment in the lecture where he's trying to look at the two different epochs of being. But here in Being in Time, he says, 1927, if Dasein by anticipation lets death become powerful in itself, then as free for death, Dasein under itself understands itself in its own superior power. And the superior power, bracket that, you're going to see the boldness of forgetting in the Hölderlin lecture, this Mut and Gemüt for courageous mind or boldness. But I'm drawing some kind of initial comparison here, superior power. The power of its finite freedom, so that in this freedom, which is only in its having chosen to make such a choice, it can take over the powerlessness of abandonment to its having done so, and can thus come to have a clear vision for the accidents of the situation that has been disclosed. So in that footnote 2, if you scroll down, you can see that at least Macquarie and Robinson are, trying to give us for some of us, very speculative gesture here by what they're trying to propose. And I try to examine this a little bit more in depth. But it should be perhaps pointed out that Ohnmacht, the powerlessness that we see up here in the sentence, the Ohnmacht, they can say, can also mean a faint or a swoon. And for the non-English speakers, we have to figure out what would be comparable terms in German and French and Spanish, Portuguese. It'd be very interesting to see how we can compare different variations of faint and swoon. I'll give you my interpretations of English. And then the Hellsichtigkeit is really for the clear vision. Sorry. Come out clear vision for the accidents of the situation that has been disclosed. So the English that they put up there, they can also say is a regular term for clairvoyance. Thus, the German reader might easily read into this passage a suggestion of the seer's mystical trance. So, vision, clairvoyance, mystical trance, superior power, the Ohnmacht, and the faint and the swoon. So, what are we getting at? The culminating passage, of course, where I feel division two, even though we're just in chapter five, we haven't gotten to chapter six on within timeness and datability, and of course the re-encounter with Hegel at the end, the suspension and the ending of being in time. But right here in chapter section 74, chapter five, kind of like the ecstatic death, first of all, which is how division two opens up, then ecstatic temporality, resoluteness, etc. Now we're getting to fate and historicality, and then the moment of vision. So what is said here? Only an entity which in its being is essentially futural, so that's the state of Dasein as concerned, anticipatory, and throne. Futural so that it is free for its death, that's the being towards death, and that's its greatest possibility, the possibility of impossibility, can let itself be thrown back upon its factical there by shattering itself against death. So not the fear of physical death or demising or perishing, but so it's going to get away from that, which it flees from or it embraces. Either way, that it's going to shatter itself in. That is to say, only an entity which, as futural as equiprimordially in the process of having been, it's a key problem in section 65 second temporality. How do the ecstasies relate to each other? Well, they're equiprimordially related to each other. Gleichsprünglichkeit. In the process of having can be handing down to itself the possibility it has inherited, handing down, not the past before it, but the inheritance, the tradition, the heritage, taking it over, taking it positively, taking over and taking it over, taking over its thrownness and be in the moment of vision for its time. Look at that. So we heard about the Zeitigung of Zeitlichkeit, the temporalizing of temporality in section 65, but here we're getting the Augenblick and then the its time. Only authentic temporality, which is at the same time finite, not the linear time that flows on, makes possible something like fate. That is to say, authentic historicality, Geschichtlichkeit. So that's Sein und Zeit. Let me come back to now my discussion of the Hölderlin lecture and keep moving forward. So I won't be going back to being in time now, but I just wanted to put that there before us, read the text. So for me, what's happening in that section 74 is sort of a kind of a pretext to set up a way to try to engage the mystery and the complexity of the later Heidegger, quote unquote, and particularly the 1942 lecture on the Ister, in honor of this conference, which is on the poetizing and poetry, relationship between poetry and thought. But in 74, after 74, we get to 75. I'm not going to read all of this, but we have to get into other terms about the Geschehen, historizing, Geschichtlichkeit, what we just discussed, this question of the moment of vision, the process of having been taking over the heritage, fateful repetition of possibilities that have been temporally, ecstatically, that's the heritage that's handed down. And as you move further in this section 75, he actually brings up this very strange term, the birth that's caught up into one's existence. When you shatter yourself against the possibility of death, he talks about a birth and bringing into being. This is remarkable. We don't have being towards birth, for the most part, fully developed in division two of being in time. But as you know, in the later Heidegger, he is deeply concerned with another beginning or the possibility of another beginning, given what's happened to us here in the West, the flattening of our nihilistic technological modernity. Nietzsche is not the answer either. So what is the space? What is the possibility, let's say, in Hölderlin or other poets that have been discussed that can open up this other horizon? Bracket the fact that we're not talking about ontic time here, not a recollection of past events in one's life, an autobiography, not reliving past moments of history. Marx's famous statement, first time is tragic, second time a farce. For those that are theologically or religiously inclined, as wonderful and as interesting and as mesmerized as I am about religious traditions, I'm going with the secular interpretation here. And secular is not even a good term, but ontological question that grounds the possibility of the religious. But we can't think of reincarnation in non-Judeo-Christian ancient religions, ancient Egypt, today's modern world religions of Buddhism and Hinduism. And definitely, if you think about the Christian kairos and the proclamation, recollection of past lives, but certainly not the Christian proclamation of Jesus' resurrection from the dead in a seal too. So reincarnation is one thing, resurrection, whole other theological matter, as you know, and so forth. All of this presupposes pictorially, as Hegel would say, past is a no longer now, before the now present, which one is living. And as you all know, especially the Heidegger scholars, today there seems to be some bristling about relationship, again, coming back as always to Aristotle and what he means for both the early Heidegger and the later lectures. The constant return here, but what haunts Heidegger is this the opening that we get in Book 4 of the Physics, Chapter 10 on time. That's when Aristotle takes on time directly. The now is what limits itself in relation to the no longer and not yet, and yet it bears a relation to them insofar as the now is being prepared to become them. Ecstatic temporality for me in Heidegger is not this. It's not just a sheer kind of repetition or stealing or representation there. So there's something else, as we all know, going on in Heidegger. But having said that, there's enough complexity already here in Aristotle's aporias. Because for Aristotle too, so many times he'll say, well, it's not a sequence of nows, but not sure what it is. And I'm just going to leave it there. It's a very short section, chapter 10 of book 4, before he moves on to change and other aspects of the physics. But here, in terms of encountering time, there's a lot of ambiguity already in Aristotle. Also, time is not movement, but has some relationship to it, which is unclear. So for sure, time is not movement, but it has some relationship to it. Putting all this out there because it's going to set up this question of the Ister, the metaphor of the river. One other contrast before we move on to the actual 1942 lecture. We got to divide this great problematic and tradition in theology, which the early Heidegger had to reckon with. Really early Heidegger, I would say 1915, all the way up to the 1920-21 lecture on phenomenology of religious life, and then 1924, the concept of time, on and on and on. 1927, phenomenology and theology comes back to it. So it's recurrent sort of it's the ancient Greeks for sure, all the way up to Kant and Hegel. So the Western philosophical tradition, there's also a reckoning in the 20s with this theological context in Marburg. But we know for sure that what we're going to see in Being and Time and then the 1942 lecture is also not this Christian mystery. Historical time is linear with BCE and CE, and 0 is the dividing event. Jesus' life and death is somewhere there around that 0, the death presumably somewhere around 33 CE. The theological registers, kairos in the Greek, propitious time, fulfilled time, not chronos. Kairos is the fulfillment of time and the sending of the sun. Galatians. Incarnation of the eternal Logos, prologue to the Gospel of John. Life, death, and resurrection, ascension back to the eternal Logos. It's the Gospel tales. The idiomata, communicata, Trinitarian life for the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. How do all these three persons equal one God in this monotheistic religion? And the post-resurrection of Jesus and the sending of the Holy Spirit to the earthly church, from its establishment in Jesus on earth through Peter up to the historical present, say the current Pope and the Vatican. These are the theological registers. They're all very complex. There is a phenomenological richness, both in Heidegger and beyond, to reckon with it. But we're going to have to see what is this wholly other challenging moment that we're going to see in Hölderlin and, quite frankly, the Schelling of 1809, which is what the lecture that Heidegger lectures on in 1936. The Nietzsche lectures, of course, but there's all these different attempts in the 30s and beyond to go against all this Christian themes. For another opening of the West, we haven't seen another opening in the West. Parousia, expectation of the second coming, the new heaven and earth, John's revelation, and Paul's Thessalonians. So, as far as I know, and Alfred can correct me, I don't know if there are any early lectures on John's revelation, but there are certainly the early lectures on the Thessalonians. Footnote for me is always Hegel. I'm not going to get into it, but the transition at the very end of the phenomenology of spirit is a direct reckoning of all these themes in the real religion before one last Alphaben to get to this mysterious absolute knowing. But let's keep that there. Okay, here are some conditions. And you think of other conditions as well. Let's have a conversation. And I'm not saying this is the list. This is just what comes to mind for me about some of the conditions I keep in place before I try to go into anything in the late Heidegger, or at least this 42 lecture. So given what we just said, detach time from space and movement from motion of something or motion of something and something else. We're not just going to repeat all the Aristotelian problematics, which is suspend any inner sense or obfuscations of the relation between time and movement. It's that chapter 10, book 4. Bracket and reduce phenomenologically any sense of time as past, present, future. Most human beings normally associate past with memory or trauma. Present, living right now. It's 10:46 a.m. my time. We're on Zoom. We're all present together. So that's clock and counter time, whether we're sleeping or awake. In the future, typically, for a lot of folks, it's anticipation, it's anxiety, it's responsibility, commitment, duty. Tomorrow I got to do this. I got to finish the talk. I got to go take care of kids, etc. And then getting closer to the lecture itself, the river, ontologically understood, as an alternative to all metaphysical conceptions of one-directional history and historical time. So ontologically understood, it's not any of those one-directional notions of historical time. It's not the real river, the Danube, although we can get into that because obviously this is Heidegger's primordial Heimlichkeit or Unheimlichkeit in Heimlichkeit, you'll see. But this is where he gets his beginnings in Meskirk, right? I think the proximity that he has to it. And then those that are greater experts, and I'll ever be in the whole field of literature and comparative literature and theories of metaphor, but I want to bracket that. It's not the space I'm going into. We have to cross out this notion of the origin and end of history schemes, but also the non-origin. I'm sorry for this departure into a little bit of Derrida, because the difference between origin and non-origin as unpresentable difference, the problem of difference in Derrida, différence, delay and differentiation. Origin and non-origin themselves, they have a trace of presence in them. We intuitively think, oh, what do they mean? And Derrida is questioning this. That itself, this difference beneath even all these registers is erased and traced, but it just, for the Derrida, at least in his reckoning of both Hegel and Heidegger and Aristotle at one time, 1968, says that, is there something older than Heidegger's ontological difference? He doesn't say what, but he's trying to make his own critiques of all these big figures. And I say that the last box can do that for the end and non-end of history too. The problem of kairos and parousia. Différence is non-present event movement of differing and deferring, postponing, delaying, but this event of differentiation. And so for Derrida, particularly in the 90s onwards, that this thesis of the end of history. For example, the Americans won the Cold War. Fukuyama says, oh, end of history, democracy, capitalism, the US, blah, blah, blah. That's the end of it. Everybody else, you just catch up. And Derrida's already critiquing this, rightfully so. But the endless kind of nihilism, either the endless nihilism of modernity goes on forever, or the endlessness of our progress as humans in history, both of those are also, take us away from an authentic finite temporalization. Okay. This, I think, I'm not going to read the big box down here, but I want to give us at least now a juxtaposition of being in time, the 42 lecture. And what my aim always is to try to imagine the missing division 3. And quite frankly, if you say a missing division 3 to being in time, it doesn't mean that you're talking about what was not published or offered to Jaspers. but then decided upon not to publish back in 1927. The division three can be always in relationship to being in time, but it can be composed of, the later Heidegger, which is what we're going to get into. We have to ask some questions about the complexity of the temporality of the demigod and the gods. What about the Beiträge on the last god? The post-1935 works, and someone can correct my chronology here, but 33 we're ending with some of the big lectures on Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, and then Hegel. And then he takes his break, he's the rector of the Freiburg, and then he leaves that, and then he begins. 35 seems to be the introduction to metaphysics, critical threshold, and then the Nietzsche lectures. So the Greeks of the 7th to the 4th centuries, CE, pre-Socratics to Plato and Aristotle, and as pre-Christian, but the Germans, as we know, Kant to Hegel to Schelling to Nietzsche to Heidegger, as post-Christian, or at least a critical, the great philosophical departure, break, criticism of Christian metaphysics up to that point. My thesis about four-dimensional time, I don't know, I'll just bracket that there, but I want to come back to the very last box in the bottom right. Sorry, I can't point to it. Maybe I can. The West surprises itself unhomely at the beginning and becoming homely. Now we're getting into the Hölderlin lecture. And this structure is outside of Christianity. At least the schematic formulations are presented about Kairos and Parousia. The alterity of the West hovering on the other side, which is neither origin nor end, the crossing out of both poles. Okay, so some quotes from the actual 42 lecture. The proper and foreign to the Greeks is distinct from what is proper and foreign to the Germans, straight out of the 42 lecture. And think about the time period when Heidegger's writing, 3 years into the war. The difference between the two is reciprocal, and in the encounter they come to relate. Linear time will tell us, oh, the ancient Greeks were back there. Heidegger is sitting in 1942, at least at this point, and Kant's 1781. They obviously come after the Greeks. They're modern. They're the Greeks are so old. These guys are more recent. And Heidegger's going to talk about the destinings of both. How are these two encountering each other? How are we? We're sitting here now, and we're trying to listen to Heidegger and take him seriously. Like, why is he? What is this apotheosis of the Greeks and the Germans? Very problematic, right? Yeah. But the unhomely in the beginning is what he takes from Hölderlin and Nietzsche and Schelling and many others, is that there's not something already quite unsettled in the heart of the ancient Greek beginning. There's an unhomeliness in this. So the project is to, maybe we all feel this way. Maybe you all want to think about it in your own way, the authentic Dasein that you are. How do we become homely? Unless we want to stay unhomely, and we like that, or we think becoming homely is impossible. There's hope here. We all know that there's a lot of hope in this terrible moment that Heidegger's and the world is living through in 42. Letting the foreign come towards. In section 65 on ecstatic temporality, we have the Kunft, letting itself come towards itself as the definition of the future. It's one of the ecstasies. And then Geschichtlichkeit, historicality. Now I pause briefly because I want to read just one paragraph from the 42 lecture, where we will spend the rest of the talk. And we will have about 10-15 minutes for discussion. So if we can see page 128 of the Hölderlin lecture, this is the last part of the whole lecture. So I'm just going to read this paragraph here and then go back to my interpretations. Finding, I think someone is unmuted. It's not me. Oh, okay. Finding what is fitting and being unhomely is becoming homely. So we got to find what is fitting, appropriateness to one's own, to be really one's own. Even though the state of the beginning for the West is the unholy, the unheimlichkeit, the forgetfulness of being is another way to put it, the leveling of the ontological difference. And therefore the primordiality of historic that temporality, the whole relationship between being and time, the whole project of being and time, the early Heidegger up to being and time. It's a whole new take on the question of the meaning of being. Let's remember all that. It made what was offered to the Greeks, what is being ontology, and it's not, you know, as Heidegger says in the introduction, being in time is not it's the beginning, of course. And he himself doesn't have the power of those great minds, philosophical minds. But that trajectory of posing and trying to answer that question from the Greeks up to Hegel, as he says, right from the science of logic, there's something forgotten here. We got to pose the question of the meaning of being anew. We have to do this analytic of Dasein to even be remotely close to the chance of trying to do fundamental ontology again. And time becomes the question. Preserving such becoming is that being historical that attains its essential fullness. There you go, fullness. When it comes to know what has been fittingly destined for it. Das Zugeschickte. Fittingly destined for it is that which has already been. So we've seen that theme in Being and Time, section 74 and 75. That which is fittingly destined for human beings is what Geist, spirit, thinks. So presumably in contrast to Hegel's Geist, this is the other Geist coming through Heidegger on Hölderlin. And thinks is directed toward human beings so that it is spirit in historical human beings that determines historicality. Okay? Yet what is fittingly destined for them always remains for human beings that which is coming. It's not eschatological. It's not an end of history. It's not fulfilled in the system, the science of logic, over all those other previous shapes in the history of metaphysics for Hegel. All those were incomplete, contradictory. But in credit to Hegel, they're not just false or stupid. They have to fill themselves up, and it's his method of the negation dialectic that has to go through all those moments again for the shape to come to be. But Heidegger is going to do something remarkably distinct, different, in challenging that. What is this for human beings which is coming toward them, that which is future? That anticipation of what can't be anticipated. What is fittingly desired for us is never something that has been decided. Okay, so that's not past, that's all ontic stuff. Past, present, future. It's certainly not Trump's speech to the UN, if any of you had to endure that monstrosity. What is fittingly destined for us is never something that's been decided. It remains full of destinies, and it's only from out of them. What is fittingly destined for us sends its destiny, seek, in one way or another, and always remains incoming. Because there's a lot there in terms of this temporal complexity. Maybe we compare and contrast it with the ecstatic temporality of section 65. In such coming, however, it can be thought only in being taken up and preserved as what is coming. Preservation of what is coming, it's never been decided. We're going back to being unhomely again through a Hölderlin, who had the genius to unsettle the structure, but kind of poetically bring us to this very warm and compassionate space of how we re-reckon, and it's all future because, no one's just sitting there thinking about the past for the sake of it. This is about what do we do about our terrible historical present. Reckon in terms of what is actual, what is coming is that which is not yet actual, yet something non-actual that is already acting. What is coming and is coming is experienced and preserved in the poetizing. So this is the problematic, the question of the poet, the relationship between poetizing and thinking, poetizing as an event or an action. But here's the very important part. What is coming, the historically grounding spirit must therefore first find its site in the mindful courage. And somebody with the proper German pronunciation, I don't want to say mutt, and I don't know, it doesn't have the umlaut. I'm going to just say mut. So if someone has the right pronunciation, they can teach me, but I'm used to the umlauts. But mut of the poet. And then the mind, gemüt, there's the umlaut, the gemüt, mindful courage of the poet, and then the form mind, gemüt, is soul. Not the principle of animal plant life, but the essence in the mind that takes up the thoughts of spirit into the wealth of its mindful courage. Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to be able to deal with in terms of the actual terms in the German. I'll keep moving along, and believe it or not, my presentation will end sooner than later. It's not going to go on forever. Okay, but I do want to do some analysis here of what we just saw in those very fundamental terms in the 42 lecture. The historical temporalization, historicality, that authentic fate that he talks about in section 74, the moment of vision, requires a deep deconstruction of any residue or trace in terms of a sense of eternality. When Heidegger says never or always, he's not giving us some kind of injunction. It's like he's propositionally stating a metaphysical truth. There's never and always. It doesn't mean that type of eternity. There's the example, yet what is fitting and fittingly destined for them always remains for human beings that which is coming towards them, that which is future. In his critique of linear time, the future in the normal sense is that, oh, it's always that tomorrow that's coming. You can't stop it. We're going into the past, we're going into the future, but we're not just sitting still. It's always coming. What are we going to do about it? Whether we're alive or dead, it's going to go on, as he says in even the chapter on death. Even after we die, the problem is that, or even us, will kind of continue in others. And so that linear time is not properly situated to the Dasein and to understand what being towards death truly means. What is finally destined for us is never something that's been decided. That seems like another injunction. It remains full of the destinies. What I say in the second paragraph here, we must scaffold all the inquiries, propositions, and instructions in section 65 like static temporality and the equiprimordiality of the differing relations of the ecstasies. Remember, he says that although he tries to talk about each one, first the future, then the process of having been, then the making present. But by the time we get to the end of 65, he's like, well, each one has its relationship to the others in a different way. That's very complicated. There is a one set of interrelations between all of them that you describe. And you can't conceptualize that as a notion, which Hegel tried to do, according to him. But he leaves us in suspense there. But what can we do now with that section 65? All of division 2, and then even what could have been the division 3. Well, maybe there's inspiration here in this 42 lecture. How do we develop them further by drawing inspiration by these generalized or rather lofty kerygma, proclamations that we find in the 42 lecture? All those great moments in being in time, the finitude of temporality, being towards death. Death is a possibility that is never experienced as perishing or demising, from which one returns to tell. It's not that. The coming or the Kunft, or the future nature as the priority for primordial care. All this cannot be derived from the present now or the flowing nows. The passing away, past is no longer now, future is yet to be now. And as you know, in terms of the scholarship, at least for the being in time phase, it seems to be the problematic of an individual Dasein, even though there are so many debates about the collective destiny and the folk and what he means. What is he when he goes from individual Dasein and ecstatic temporality for the individual Dasein, and the individual being to the collective sense of the fates of the people in the generation. All the big debates about that. And I'm not just talking about the late stream, the huge debates about Heidegger and the Nazism, but just this question of the collective in what seems to be this idea of the individual Dasein. I don't take the standard interpretation. I don't care about whether we think it's an individual Dasein in being time or the they or the collective, which is what I try to say later on. It's irreducibly self versus society. That's ontic. Individual versus collective. All those are binary structures that Heidegger easily deconstructs, and is the first to do so, if you ask me, in the history of modern philosophical thought. We're not talking about sociology, so I apologize to all the sociologists. We're not there. For me, especially, there's no isolated self, I, ego, soul, or spatially enclosed body in being in time. Tell me I'm wrong, that's fine. You can have your interpretation. But I don't have any idea of I or self, even the Dasein that we are all in terms of our own individual kind of being thrown in the world. Chapter 4 is unsettled, very uncanny, unheimlich, the unheimlich beginning. The who question, because there's Mitsein with being, mit Dasein with Dasein, other Dasein. Being oneself, that doesn't mean just being alone, in your room. And the overriding they that constantly invades us, which is also equiprimordially built into us. And that's the problem of fallen. Can't get rid of them. Not just because we're sitting here thinking about others, but it's already built into our attempt to reckon with those the three registers, mit sein, mit Dasein, being and so. Okay. So to open up section 65 on static temporality and equiprimordiality of different relations of each exceed the others, the underdeveloped being towards birth. Now we're in chapter 5. The relationship being towards birth, being towards death, stretchedness, and the self-stretching, the mystical trance, moment of vision, authentic history, infinite temporality, the whole problem of ontological movement of history, which is not, what historians look at, history, something else. For Heidegger is a return to them in an unhomely way. But this returning arises out of the reflections in the 42 lecture against any simple notion of beginning, source, commencement, as in the origin of Western Dasein, the Logos, philosophy. Returning relates to destining, but not in any temporal registers or lines. Definitely not to the Protestant Christian breaks. For example, Calvin. You don't think of destiny as preordained with the predestination of the elect from the eternal God. Rather, it's the uncanny event of coming from a beginning. So all of you that descend from the West, which I think is many of you, and you're the great Greek beginning coming from the, which itself is outside itself. So this beginning, it's other to itself, and therefore not present in the past. Nothing you can do with dialectics to help you. The origin is a problem. This is page 30 from the Hölderlin lecture. And then I want to just see where analysis quote. I'll skip many of these because I'm not going to be able to get to that. So 11:07. I want to end in about 5-6 minutes, so I'll have to pick and choose which of these. Let me just go back to this quote here. In the beginning of the history of any humankind, the destiny fittingly destined for that humankind is indeed assigned to it. What has been assigned is coming. Whoa. The last God, not the second coming of Jesus, not anything any of the world leaders today tell us about the future of anything on this planet, about any policy or issue. So I keep referring to it because the UN just invited all the leaders to the General Assembly. So it's not those ontic beings talking about something else. What is it? Because what is coming is still veiled and equivocal. For this reason, we cannot immediately delimit unequivocally or clearly attend to whatever it is that is fitting. Well, let me pause there. Hegel's master-slave dialectic is a problem for all Western beings because of this battle or conflict for recognition, the fight to the end, which he shows philosophically is a problem of consciousness itself and self-consciousness, conscious self-consciousness. How do you overcome all those contradictions in the history of metaphysics? Schelling will respond to him saying, Hegel, you don't think this is going to culminate in some kind of concept of the absolute. There's something else going on here, as he says to it, which Heidegger picks up on. Nietzsche's critique of pretty much everything. The story is about not a nice one. It doesn't end with some happy idea that's this total revelation of what the West was destined to become philosophically. It ends in this kind of complexity and mystery. And what he says, it's veiled. In the beginning, a historical humankind is unable to move freely within the open and ordered possibilities of its essence. So we're kind of diagnosing that even in the ancient Greek opening, there's something, some unfreedom there in the space of thinking. It is still closed off from that destiny that is fittingly destined for it. It is thereby, in a certain manner, still excluded from the origin of its own essence. In the beginning, the Unheimlichkeit for the West has an exclusion, meaning the origin of its own essence is still excluded in that origin. That's very strange. The historical humankind in question is not yet intimately familiar with the unfolded and essential fullness of its destiny. It's not at home in it. So in the beginning, there's the Unheimlichkeit, unhome. There's a lack of freedom. There's an exclusion of the original essence. And for Heidegger, through the poets, starting with the Hölderlin, and I know the last and Rilke is interested in some of the 20th century poets. But for Hölderlin, to see that there's still the possibility that if we can relate ourselves to all this, we can put ourselves on a path to being receptive to the opening of a whole other sense of meaning again, even though we feel lost or not at home. I'll, I'll just keep moving to some more quotes that I need. In that last passage about the mut, the courage. To boldness there belongs a knowledge that of that oak upon which everything in our action and in what we can endure depends in advance. It is from out of such knowledge that boldness has its nobility, in contrast to mere courage. In the sense of the passion pertaining to a striving, it kind of looks like the Übermann or Zarathustra. Boldness is a knowing and mindful courage, der wissender Mut. In such knowing there lies the ground of that steadfastness and composure and circumspection that characterize whoever is bold, being in time Entschlossenheit, resoluteness, or the Standig that we get in chapter 5 on the constancy of the stretchedness of Dasein being thrown, finitely temporalized in a finite way, yet futurely open to the possibility of the meaning of being itself, if you can get there, but not flowing in linear time. Steadfastness. Bold forgetting is the knowledge and mindful courage to experience the foreign. That's going to be my question for all of you when we do our discussion. What is the foreign to the Western Dasein? And experiencing that in the foreign steadfastly gives thought to one's own. To bring the Greeks are foreign to the Germans and vice versa, and they both have their own destinies. But in the encounter, maybe they can. Well, the German Heidegger is part of the Germans. He's still alive. The Greeks are dead. Maybe give a chance to overcome the Unheimlichkeit, to be at home again. The boldness, forgetting, and the love of the colony is a readiness while in the foreign to learn from the foreign for the sake of what is one's own, so as to defer what is one's own until it's time. Remember the it's time. Again, kind of like not my rules or principles, but for me, I kind of can try to like bracket. How do I come back to the being in time? What do I need to be careful about when I'm trying to deal with what we just read in the 42 lecture? Compare and contrast everything in that passage. I mentioned this with resoluteness, anxiety, care, freedom, guilt, and being in time. Division 2. The later Heidegger, we'll find so much to draw from in terms of the question of poetizing, which will later be related to the holy, as we know in that lecture. We have this added term of the bold, the Mut. But as you know, in being in time, we have the issue of the hero. That word. And I'm ich vergesse, so Alfred or somebody, Akim, if you're here, if you can tell me the German of a hero. That word shows up 3 times in all of Being in Time, section 71, 74. And remember the superior power and the co-historizing of the community, the people, and the generation in 74. All these terms can be deconstructed so we don't associate any of them with Heidegger's historical and present when Being in Time was composed, the years prior to the Nazi period of Germany. Or we don't simply reduce them to ontic historical facts of that period, including events in Heidegger's life. So I apologize. We're not going to get into those debates, and people will say that's irresponsible, or unethical, or that's wrong. And just pausing for a moment and just staying with these terms to try to understand, what could be a poetic philosophical relationship between Being in Time 27 and the Hölderlin lecture. Let's get that. I don't have time for that. To a close here, the desire to go home presupposes there is a home to return to, but that presupposes an origin that occurred. Yet, if none of this can be assumed, then what? There's already alterity at the origin that prevents it from even beginning, and thus moving away from and hence installing a desire to return. maybe in a circular way or rectilinear way, then we must raise this question of the will and the boldness to become homely, while what is coming remains veiled and equivocal. All these other thinkers too have their complex temporalities. I'm going to try to conclude on this question of what does it mean to go home? But then Heidegger adds a complication. In spirit, there thus prevails a longing for its own essence. Therefore, for the sake of its essence and in obedience to the appropriation of what is its own, spirit, precisely in the beginning, at the commencement, never be at home. That is, never be homely. Spirit is essentially unhomely only when, for the sake of what is its own, from out of the will for its essence, it wills the unhomely, the foreign. My interpretation is like, don't come up with the ordinary registers of the foreign. Don't think ontically of colony as the foreign land that is alien or exotic. He himself warns us. So that means, obviously, at least the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, well, not the Spanish, Portuguese, they were colonization ended in the 19th century in Latin America. But up to Heidegger's period, a lot of the world was still colonized, the non-West, the global South, the East. So we're not talking about, Heidegger says, we're talking about another type of the foreign, not just what's foreign to the West in terms of the ontic structures. Okay, I want to stop here because I want to conclude by trying to wrap up all the threads here. It's a bit disconnected up here in terms of the pre-state, but what I'm trying to get at essentially is, I think for a lot of us, being in time is already the unhomely beginning, in a way. If ancient Greeks and the ancient Greek, the pre-Socratics, the ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, playwrights, maybe from Homer, and then Hesiod up to the poets, up to the playwrights, Sophocles, the Greek beginning has that unheimly quality. And the inspiration that he gets from Hölderlin is that how we reckon with that to see how unsettled it already is back then can shed light for us moderns, or at least for Hölderlin, that the desire to go back home is, you have to admit to this principle that the beginning itself is already something uncanny, not just the kind of state we're in now. And if that's the case, then there's this consuming, as he says, of this source. There has to be some strength or will to push ourselves not to be so settled. If we're going to say that past is unsettled, then we certainly are unsettled, but we have to have the courage to reckon it. And the courage means putting ourselves and our own identity at risk if you have to encounter what's foreign. Certainly not what's happening here in the US with the borders and the immigration, or what you're seeing throughout every right-wing structure in the world, which is the national borders and accusing some other that you have to go oppress and kill or expunge from the border. Something the later Derrida was concerned with way back even 20 years ago. But so I guess the philosophical question is this encounter between an origin that's unheimly. My question for the group is, what would you say is becoming homely? What is this? What is the status or the great value that Heidegger has to put into poetry or art or other manifestations in the later Heidegger or his own poetized thinking, like in the Beiträge? Because for me, I sometimes, the uncanny is when being in time stops being in time, and I see one big text. I just see this continuity. This sounds really strange. I see all those things going on in being in time, obviously said in a different way than what's happening in the 1942 lecture. And it's not just a repetition, but if he's saying the Germans and the late Heidegger is saying the German state, and then the Greeks, I'm just saying in a more circumscribed way, being in time, pre-being in time, being in time, and all the later period is all of it as a type of communicata idiomata, internal communication. by the same person and author, obviously, and as this constant attempt to imagine that other horizon for the West. And for me, the other horizon of the West is a whole other relationship between being and time, which is already there, signaled in being time, and then throughout, which he never articulated. You guys have heard me say this many times, True Times for eventually, 1962. And another talk, hopefully, would be a chance to introduce the massive conceptual structure that underpins that. So I will end there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your patience for a PowerPoint instead of a paper. I appreciate the discussion to come.
Thank you, as always, Raya, for your penetrating presentation. We have some time for questions or comments. If anybody wants to challenge you. James is the first to raise his hand, so I'll go to him.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Raj. For the discussion, you posed the question, what does it mean to go or be at home? And I think as Heidegger's lecture course on Hölderlin's Ister unfolds past the pages you quoted, pages 130, 132, it seems to me he gets a little bit clearer about what it means to go home and what it means to be home. And in my reading, what that means for Heidegger is to go back to, is to allow oneself to be where one always already is. And that is in the source, which is making our existence possible. But to be more specific, what it means to be at home and go at home is to dwell in the nearness of the enigma, das Rätsel. And what emerged in yesterday's conversations, to be close to the secret or the mystery, das Geheimnis, and then to be drawn by it, closer to it, listening to it, becoming more heedful of it, more watchful, more vigilant. And only then can whatever is coming show itself or be itself. But whatever comes, it will always be more enigmatic and or mysterious. So when I think about what it means to go home or what is coming, I like you want to really resist any ontic determinations.
Yeah.
So that's how I would respond to your question.
James, Keith, thank you, James. I have something to say. Keith, did you want to come in? Oh, thumbs up.
Yeah.
If to turn on your mic.
Yeah, just to add, and that's how I usually talk in here, is just complimenting what other people say. Is that not just a closeness, but an intimacy with that? And that intimacy is essential, even in later Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not intimate, it's fearful. It could terrify, right? So this is that preparatory being, I suppose, before being, and all the rest of betweenness. So what do you think of that, Rajesh?
Well, that's interesting because what James is saying about the Ratzel in 75, the enigma of motion, or that Ohnmacht, the powerlessness, the clairvoyance in the swoon. And then we get to the Hellsichtigkeit on the clairvoyance, but the fainting in the swoon. It's that vulnerability, but that intimacy and compassion in the heart that you find, first of all, the beautiful poetry of Hölderlin at that time, that threshold moment. But if you all take the time to even Hegel's the icy cold man, the old system, but and Schelling kind of warms it up with the later critique of it. Even in the later Schelling, 1809, which Heidegger, of course, gives a massive lecture on, there's a lot of credit for that finite freedom and love, even in passage love, but not the St. Paul, the New Testament conception of that kind of love, but it's an agape that lies in the Godhead itself as the non-ground, which we'll never be able to identify. Later Schelling is on the way before you can get to Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and everybody else that wants to take down Hegel. But you're right. And James, but what I want to say to the Western Dasein, and I guess I have to exclude myself because my ancestry, as you know, is not in the West, but I'm fully, if you're inside this from birth to now, in this Western Dasein, and you're saying that the ancient Greeks have the enigma, and if you don't want any quick answers since that forgetfulness or leveling of being to name being and just conceptualize it and calcify it, but open it up again so that mystery remains, as you said, James, and it comes because you don't want to be settled in your own. It's about that striving and that willing. That's the courage part. But if you're not going to repeat the Judeo-Christian answers, you don't have a messianic expectation. The first Jesus who's on the cross, he's going to come back in some pictorial form. And, apocalyptically, we're going to go through the apocalypse with some people because basically saying it's happening now, and all the terrible things that are happening in the world. And that there's literally this new creation, new heaven and earth. To submit that to an Alphabean like Hegel speaks of at the end of the phenomenology. And for Heidegger to say, well, wait a minute, no, don't just replace the metaphysical completion of the Judeo-Christian structure with some kind of logical, scientific, metaphysical conception. That's not going to help us. The real challenge is to have that intimate connection to the unholiness. That means all of you, by the way, because you can't have the pride of Trump who says, this is what we're about, and everybody else can just go to hell, which everyone was disgusted by around the world, as you probably saw the reaction. None of you are like that. And yet you got to live, you want to undo the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman pillars of the West, and you want to expose yourself to the foreign, but not go all the way, because we're not talking about embracing Hinduism or Buddhism or Eastern structures
Yes.
that are irreducible in their nature. What does that say about you all, if I can put it back on you, with regard to how you interpret the current? How can you be courageous, James, and Keith and others, in this state? Yes, please, Keith.
Well, because I'm pre-literal in my thinking. I grew up with Marshall McLuhan, right? So I'm a Canadian.
Oh, okay, you got your exempt from.
So
sorry,
I'm exempt.
From back to the,
yes,
you got an exemption for the.
I'm multicultural, right?
No,
so
but you and Marshall are still you're products of the Western, but you're products of the Western Dasein.
I know,
And
but
Marshall too.
I can see a pluralization of Daseins, this pluralism opening up. It doesn't matter if it's established or non-established or written or spoken. But what's important is that we remain open to many others.
But doesn't it make you
other than just the other? And that's essential.
This is an honest question. When you all read the 40, for example, I know you're reading out the text in the lip here, but this lecture, we just did a little bit. And as James said, later on humanism, it's going to be about, okay, before you even get to being, you got to really rethink the divine, the holy, God, and then being later. That's the only chance. But you got to redo all those others. Don't you feel anxious when you read this text?
No, because I've never read Being in Time.
Oh, okay. Well, if you mean that in a certain kind of special way, but
this text here. I know, but I think outside of Being in Time because I never went in. I started with the Bitrick.
Good. Good for you.
And but so that is my foundation. So I'm not antithetical to you, Raj. I'm operating in thinking historically, being historical thinking.
So you're but this if you're unheimly in the beginning and you've got to become, what does becoming homely mean to you? I have none of this. I don't even have the unholy in the order.
I don't become.
And I don't even know what becoming homely means. What does that mean to you?
I don't become. To me, there's no becoming. There's simply being.
Okay. Well, can I get others to tell me what they, or maybe back to James or others, what do you really feel? Don't you feel like, if I were you, I'd feel really anxious to read this stuff. It's very scary.
Always vibration. Always not intense, but alive in a sense, like ready to go.
Good for you.
I'm here to go. Here to go. Here to go.
I'll insert my voice here and take up the challenge. I just happened to have Heidegger's Ister lecture right in front of me because I was working on something yesterday.
Good.
And I think if you go to page 150, you see Heidegger pulling together a number of remarkable words, all started on or grounded on the Mut, courage. And I'll just read a passage at the very top of page 150. Quote, a sign is needed, as we are told in turn by the and at the end of line 54. He's referring to the poem. In order that, quote, the heavenly feel themselves warmed by one another. And it seems to me that what he's getting at here is that that Dasein sort of becomes heavenly when, in the presence and company of one another, there's a sense of genuine warmth and openness and mystery and respect and letting be. And then right in that paragraph, he draws a lot of these moot words together. We become ever more vermutet, more careful and surmising and careful in our language and our questioning, searching. He has the word anmut here, charm, langemut. We become more forbearant,
Sampath, gentleness.
Gentleness, sanftmut. And he doesn't have these other words moot here, but he has them in other places. We become armut, we become poor, so that we become rich again, rich in a new and deeper, more gentle, kind, and friendly way. And he doesn't have the word edelmut here, but we become patient and noble-minded. And if you ask me what it means to come home or go home, it seems to me that what Heidegger's suggesting here applies to all world religions. So we don't have to buy into any one of them. What it really means to be at home, I'll finish up here. I'll just draw on, this just comes to mind, I'll draw on something the Dalai Lama once said, and that is, my religion is kindness. And for me, it's something as simple as that. Now, I don't know.
You all seem like a very kind person. Alfred is the most kind, if you ask me. But the way you brought that, James, and if you kept reading, is it about merely being human? No, not yet God. Something in between, the demigod, the signs needed. But I'll tell you this: what do you all do with the fact that this is 1942 and all those accusations? Because this doesn't look like National Socialism. This doesn't look like the Trump America I have to live in, or Putin's Russia, or all these other. This is something other, and it's for the West. The Imperial West that did all this terrible stuff historically for the last 500 years and is continuing to do terrible things. But here is this not the opening or sign for the possibility of a reorientation for Western Dasein itself against atavism, imperialism, narcissism, psychosis? This is this is something that's not even the project of colonization and encountering the foreign.
Well, decoloniality, right? Decolonizing. It's not anti, or it's decolonizing.
This is a decolonizing moment, if you ask me.
Yes, yes, that's what I mean.
But you guys find a type of, so Nietzsche says, the nihilism of Europe. What does he say in the Genealogy of Morals? He goes don't, and this sounds terrible, but he goes, the answer can't be a Buddhism for us Europeans as the answer to our nihilism. So and that sounds terrible coming from Nietzsche. First of all, there is now a lot of Buddhism in the West as an antidote.
Yes,
but I
feel like if I say any more, I'll just be adding too much. But I see no reason why Buddhism, generalized, derobed, wouldn't help anybody that adopts it in its most basic practices of cultivating mindfulness and openness.
You can live with this continuous coming of what's veiled and equivocal.
Loving kindness, metta for everybody, and it seems to me that could be helpful. But nobody has to go sit under the Bodhi tree or anything like that. We can work.
But this linkage of this compassion, and both of you said this, is back to those statements about always veiled, always coming, always remaining in the mystery. It's in the encounter with what's foreign. Foreign meaning what could be outside of one's own immediate sense of community or place or upbringing, which we know, and Alfred can tell more about the location of the specificity of the Meskirk and Freiburg for the Heidegger story at the deepest philosophical level. I think I sent that to you, Alfred, but why the chronological biographies now has to tell us specifically why that childhood upbringing was so critical in that space and what it meant to him. Because if you think of it ontically, it may seem like he just wants to return back to that. That's
No.
obviously more than that.
It couldn't even return back. could go back to the place, but not to how it was when he was growing up there.
And he constantly returned to Buron, didn't he? Did he not?
He went there a lot in the earlier years, and later he kept returning to it. It's part of his provenance. It's also on the Danube River, the Ister, so that's also indicated in the poem, I think, for Heidegger.
I think for me, as an outsider to the origin of the West, is having not grown up in the Christian structure, but coming to it and into it, is this wanting to maybe go against the mainstream. I know there are other ways into this veiledness and mystery and this compassion agency that you speak about, Keith and James, but a reoccupation and a re-relationship to Christianheit. So, and I know we don't have time, we want to close, but there still has to be a chance in the later Heidegger, which sounds like it's completely not Christian, to engage the early Heidegger on a re-entry into not Christian proclamation, but the appropriation, the event. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we need to finish. I'm being the bad guy here for a change, but thanks
That's
again.
impossible.